Okay, let's start with you.
A question for both Sheena and Jean-Michel. I'm wondering if you could say how many hepatitis C virus acute infections you might have seen. I know, Sheena, you said you tested people if indicated, and what did you consider was indicated, whether sexual transmission was included in that?
So, well, we saw 6 infections. 2 of them, I think you couldn't definitely say were incident because a Hep C negative test was just before they enrolled. So perhaps if you just consider the 4 that arose in the study, 3 were in the deferred and 1 was in the immediate. What are the risk factors that we use in the clinic for testing for Hep C routinely? Intravenous drug use, fisting, sharing sex toys, group sex. So that's in our national guidelines.
Jean-Michel.
In terms of HCV incidence, we've seen an incidence of roughly 2 per 100 participants year of follow-up. So pretty high incidence of HCV infection.
Okay, next question.
Hi, Michael Smith from MedPage Today. I have actually a question for both Dr. McCormick and Molina, one after the other, so I'll just say them both and then you can answer in turn. The first question is, Dr. McCormick, and I think this may apply to your study as well, Dr. Molina, that you had this higher than expected incidence of infection. Any idea why that was? And then if you assume that the incidence was as expected, did you still get a significant reduction with the PrEP? And then the question for Dr. Molina is, if I remember correctly, IPREX sort of counted 4 pills a week as complete coverage, and you had people having sex once a week and therefore taking 4 pills. Is there any real difference between that and continuous PrEP?
Shall I answer that first? So I think it wasn't altogether surprising. So those 100,000 gay men who attend the clinics every year, about half of them are using condoms consistently. So it's a much smaller proportion who are having frequent condomless anal sex. In terms of the reduction across the background incidence, the incidence in the immediate group was 1.3, so that's still more than a 50% reduction against our background incidence.
Well, thank you for your question, because I think that's an important matter. You're right, in IPREX, in post-hoc analysis, they have shown that people who had drug levels that were consistent with the use of 4 pills a month, according to data from... for a week. Thank you. That's the translation. 4 pills per week or more, according to data from another study, showed that the overall reduction in HIV incidence was 42%, whereas in our study, using the same number of pills per week, but we measured that, the reduction in HIV incidence was 86%. So it means to me that, somewhere the data are consistent that with 4 pills a week, you might be protected, and I guess the data are consistent with each other. The other thing is, it's probably different to take 4 pills a week anytime, or to take the pills at the right time, meaning at the time of sexual exposure. So I think, again, the data could be quite consistent, but I think if you have to take fewer than a daily regimen, then you have to take the pills at the right time.
Well, so it takes a Frenchman, Jean-Michel, to remind us timing is everything in love. So next question.
I'm waiting to say that.
Fred Scheikai, Follow TV. This question is for Helen Reese. You indicated a high benefit with sufficient use, with a great percentage of use on your gel. So there was some use and there was some benefit and there was that population. Did you have any focus groups or anything to determine what it is that they did or how they managed to make this happen as opposed to those that didn't? And maybe, I know that this is something that you have to work out and you're very frustrated with it, but it seems like this is something we need to really, as you said, other interventions or other tools or applications. I'm not sure what it is that you're looking for. Maybe you can tell something about that.
Yes, so just to emphasize that this was then from a sub-study looking at tenofovir levels and looking at HIV protection, where we appeared to have a 52% protection. But overall, it did seem that this sort of small number of women, 13% in the semi-objective measures and 22% in the tenofovir levels, had consistent detection. So it's a small percentage of women, but it is a percentage of women who do manage to use this correctly. And it would appear, and this is consistent with the other studies, that if you can get a high enough level, you do use it consistently, that there's at least partial protection in that subgroup. But so you're right. What we're looking at, we did in-depth social science interviews on a 5% sample at the end of the study, and we have social science data throughout the study. So we're really trying to understand now who those people are. I suspect they are going to be people who are, if you like, the more stable end of the spectrum. People who are probably in more stable relationships. We said that about 2/3 of the women were living with parents, and therefore sex often took place outside the home, and many of them, 90%, were single. So I think what we're still probably going to be left with, even if we could take that group and offer them something, we're still left with the fact that we have a lot of women whose lives are extremely challenging, and they are at the highest risk of HIV. Overall, our incidence was 4%. So this continues to be a big challenge, and we have to find better products.
This question, I guess, is for Jean-Michel. My name is Steve LeBlanc. I'm from San Francisco, and we had heard earlier Susan Buchbinder sort of poetically refer to seasons of love. And the reality for some people who practice multiple partner or high-risk sex is it happens in some predictable one-week vacation period or whatever. And I guess, do you feel like your results are generalizable to say, if you want to be on effective PrEP, as long as you start 2 hours before you have your first high-risk sexual experience, and you continue every day until 2 days after your first high-risk sexual experience, is that seemingly an effective way to take PrEP based on your findings? And my second question is, you keep saying 86%, and then telling us, but you've looked at the 2 that failed, and clearly they weren't taking it. So, I mean, you don't perhaps want to say that our study shows 100% effectiveness in people who actually took it, but me as a lay reporter, that looks like the conclusion I would draw from your data.
Well, thank you. I think, like every study, there are limitations in a study like that. Just because of the size is not huge, and that's why we have confidence interval around, the point estimate of efficacy. So the point estimate is 86%, but the 95 confidence interval is 40 to 99, meaning that if you really want to avoid HIV, you better use a condom. But if you make the choice not using a condom, then you may want to use a strategy that has shown some efficacy, and rather high, I would say. It's probably not 100%. And that would be, a false statement to say that it is 100% effective. But in the intent to treat analysis, it was quite effective, though probably more than what has been shown before until we heard from Sheena about the PROD results. So, well, I would think, the benefit of having intermittent regimen is also to limit the risk of adverse events, to probably improve also the cost effectiveness of the strategy. So I would think that for people who are at risk and not on a daily basis, then this regimen might be of interest for them.
Hi, Jeff Berry, Positively Or Magazine. This is for Dr. Molina. So, did you offer any kind of adherence counseling throughout the study, and did you look at if people were able to be adherent to a somewhat complex kind of regimen? And also, were there any people, did you keep track of, that took their first dose less than 2 hours before sex?
Right. I mean, it's really difficult to know exactly when people were taking their pills. We used self-reported questionnaires online that people had to fill out before the visit to really try to address this issue. And that's why we said that, among those who use PrEP, probably half of them use it exactly at the time we recommended to use it. In terms of adherence, I think what was critical for the study was the involvement of the community, and I have to underline that, the community support was great. And also we hired for the study what we call peer counselors, that were people trained by the community, were actually involved in recruitment, in counseling at the study sites, and also who were in contact with the participants by telephone, by SMS, etc. So the participants were able to reach someone anytime if they needed to. And these peer counselors were also those who would tell the participants that they have to come back to the site visit, to the site clinic, because there was something wrong with a test, an STI, or anything else. So having these people making the link between the clinic, the site clinic, and the participants was, I think, key for the success of the study.
Hello.
So he doesn't know if they took it less than 2 hours, I think, yeah.
Yes, Veronica Nosita from France. Thank you all for these great presentations today. This is a question for Jean-Michel Molina. Will you have some data about the sexual patterns of participants? Because you say that they're taking 4 pills a week on average, but perhaps they're taking 15 pills, some of them at least. We could imagine that some of them, they have quite regular intercourse during the weekend, so they take 4 pills a week, and some of them, they do perhaps 10 days of holidays, and then 20 days off because they're going to, I don't know, to visit their grandmother in the center of France. Because what I think it's really attractive in that regimen is that you tell people how to start and how to end the regimen, and this is really something that can change also the confidence of people who are taking PrEP. So I would like to know if you'll comment on this data, perhaps not today, but on other opportunities.
Well, thank you. What I could say is, and that's why I showed this slide on the, the individual pill taking behavior of the participants, that there was a lot of heterogeneity among all these participants. So you couldn't see any major trend. And so that's why people, were probably interested in this regimen, because they were not, they didn't have to use it daily.
So Jim Pickett, representing Windy City Times in Chicago. This is also for Jean-Michel Molina. You're on the hot seat again. So I'm just trying to square what was said in the early talk this morning. Raphael talked about PrEP and mentioned that it looked like there needed to be about 5 doses, 5 days of dosing to get enough drug on board for protection. Yet in your study, it looks like there was protection with 2 doses in 1 day, essentially. So how do we interpret that out here in the real world where people are seeing both of those? And even before the 5 days, we were telling folks on the ground, you need 7 days of dosing for rectal protection. And now we're basically saying, no, you don't. You need 2 a couple hours before. So the messaging is confusing.
Well, I don't think it's confusing, but I think it's complex. And, not a single study can answer all the questions. The regimen we proposed actually was very effective, as you've seen. So could you, and then how to extrapolate these data? I think we have data from the macaque model, which are also helpful, to answer some of these issues. And in the macaque models where they were challenged, weekly, rectally, the animals seem to be protected after the first challenge already, if not the second challenge. So I think that's one piece of information. The other one is when you look at our Kaplan-Meier curve of time to infection, you would see that in the placebo arm, a number of infections occur very early after the first visit, actually, whereas the first infection in the active arm only occurred after a year and a half. So that means to me that the participants receiving on-demand PrEP were protected early on with this regimen. Does that mean that they were protected for the first 2 hours or the first intake of PrEP, I just cannot answer this question. But I think they were protected very early.
Ed Sussman with MedPage Today for Dr. Reese. And you said that you analyzed the outcomes on the 22% where you found tenofovir evidence. Did you look at, did you do the same analysis for the 13% that seemed to have high use of the gel as well? Were there two separate groups, or did you mold them together?
Yes, so there were two measures of adherence which are really quite different. So the first one was on self-report and returned applicators. So in that case, we didn't know who was on placebo and who was on tenofovir. This was the whole group put together. The tenofovir level was a sub-study only looking at people in that tenofovir arm. So we only looked at levels in that sub-study. So the 13% who were high users, we will be able to, with the earlier question, have a look at what their characteristics were. Who were those women who could do it versus the women who couldn't. And we would be able to also look at the characteristics of the women linked to the tenofovir levels as well. So we will certainly look at that. But I think importantly, although it was 22% who had tenofovir found in all of those specimens, but 65% had it in some. That means 87% of the women in this study were trying to use something. And that's important if we're trying to think about were they motivated. I think they were motivated. So they wanted to do something, but their lives meant that this particular product just wasn't forgiving enough to protect them in the context of their lives.
So do you think we need a better product, longer-lasting product, rather than trying to find the ideal person for the...
Well, I think what we're saying is that we need to find products that fit into the complexity of lives. We're looking at long-acting rings at the moment. We're looking at long-acting injectables. We're looking at oral pills. But I still think that we need to also look for many of these women, and we've just heard how Apogee talks to that. They're actually doing something around sex remains something in that continuum that we still need to identify. But when we identify something, it's going to have probably higher efficacy and to hang around for longer. And I think that's borne out by your experience. So that we actually have that continuum. Because not all women will be able to take pills, and we also heard from this morning's talk that in oral PrEP, you have to take pills if you're a woman very consistently to have high efficacy. That's going to be very difficult for all women. And ARVs are not really necessarily that acceptable, and not all people will want an injection. We still need to have that whole spectrum of technology. So I think that's what we're saying, is that we've had wonderful breakthroughs for MSM from the Northern Hemisphere. It's fantastic, and we're going to learn from that for the whole field. We really are sort of further back, and we need to do an awful lot more for young women in the developing world.
I may want to add something for completeness regarding the best timing of drug use, and we will report, hopefully at Vancouver, a sub-study looking at pharmacokinetics of the drugs in the rectal tissue following drug intake. So to know, how soon after the first drug intake you get and you reach a detectable level of FTC and tenofovir in the rectal tissue in the participants.
Okay, thanks so much for your questions. Just to, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry. Marilyn Marchand from the Associated Press. This may be off base, and if it is, you can tell me, but was it ethical to have essentially a placebo group in the PROUD trial? Is it, you had a deferred treatment group, but that really is a way of saying a placebo group, because at that time you had IPREX results.
We did have the IPREX results, it's true, and when I went to the ethics committee, well, first of all, I should say we did a broad consultation, obviously, and the decision to go with this design was unanimous from the community groups, the policy makers, the funders of drug, and the clinicians, as well as the researchers. So there was a very broad consultation on the design, but of course you go to an ethics committee, and when I went to the ethics committee, the FDA had just licensed went, I think, a month later. So not only had IPREX reported, other trials had reported, and it was licensed by the FDA for use as prevention. So they asked me what would happen if the European Medicines Agency licensed it. And I said, based on our consultation, that's not what's really going to matter. It's when PrEP is in clinic. And we needed to gather this evidence as part of that evidence base to provide PrEP in the UK, because unlike the States, it's not funded through private insurance. It is funded on an equitable basis across the entire country when that decision is made. So all of those sexual health clinics would be able to offer PrEP when the NHS policy is in place.
And if I may add a few words on this issue, because that was an important issue. The reason why we had a placebo in our study was because, as you may know, the results from the different PrEP trials were quite inconsistent. And we had trials with negative results in women, and then the FemPrep, the VOICE studies, others with high efficacy in the partner's PrEP, but that was in the context of a serodiscordant couple where the HIV-infected partner was not on treatment, which was not what we usually do, in Europe at least. And we had the IPREX data with only 44% or 42% reduction, which was not huge in terms of reduction and not high enough to make this strategy a public health strategy. So we really thought we would need to confirm in our context in Europe, in MSM, the efficacy of this strategy. Also, you have to understand that involving people in a preventive trial like IPERGAY or PROUD and providing them with what we call full prevention services, including condoms, testing for STIs, counseling, access to post-exposure prophylaxis. We know from previous studies, including IPREX, that these people who actually are enrolled in these prevention trials would reduce their risk of HIV acquisition and actually by many means higher than what they could get from another intervention. So placebo doesn't mean always that people are at higher risk. And then when you get the results of the study, the results are undisputable. And they help also to promote the use of PrEP, a larger use of PrEP, because the two studies in Europe, the PROUD and the IPERGAY, have provided very high results in terms of efficacy, and these results will probably foster the use of PrEP in Europe, if not everywhere.
Thanks. I think a lot of us spend a lot of time thinking about the ethics of different trial scenarios, and I think we're only beginning to see what will be a burgeoning discussion of the ethical issues with these prevention studies. Thanks, everyone, and we will have a Meet the Experts group which will include Mitchell Warren from AVAC, Jared Baton, Helen Reese, Gustavo Doncel, and we'll be starting very briefly just right here. Thank you.